I'm Hani Saif. Welcome to our economic special coverage for today. The escalating conflict in the Middle East is driven by tensions with Iran. It's rattling global markets. Oil prices have eased slightly but remain on track for record gains, a surge that Kristalina Georgieva, the IMF managing director, warns could add 40 basis points to global inflation. Governments are scrambling to contain the rising fuel costs. The oil industry is adjusting to supply shocks. U.S. Gulf Coast crude has hit 2020 highs and refining faces mounting risks. Analysts warn prolonged disruptions could push inflation even higher.
The United States military began major combat operations in Iran.
קרא משטר הרשע באיראן, מוות לישראל, מוות לאמריקה.
We'll start off with the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, who has warned that the new conflict in the Middle East could increase global inflation risks. She said the global economy's resilience is being tested once again, and noted that if oil prices rise by 10% and remain elevated for most of the year, global inflation could increase by about 40 basis points. Georgieva urged policymakers to be prepared for unexpected shocks in this changing global environment and to plan for worst-case scenarios. Deutsche Bank has warned that the Bank of England faces renewed inflation risks as higher energy prices, driven by tensions between the United States and Iran, threaten the United Kingdom's disinflation progress. The bank said an oil shock, particularly if the Strait of Hormuz were effectively closed, could push UK inflation back towards 3% by the end of 2026. A sustained 10% rise in oil prices typically adds about 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points to inflation within 6 to 12 months. If oil prices stay above $100 a barrel, the Bank of England may need to pause its planned easing cycle to avoid wage-driven second-round inflation. Ladies and gentlemen, as we speak, there are reports of strikes and hits at the southern suburbs of Dahya of Lebanon. Let's take a look and we'll be right back. These were Israeli strikes that hit the southern suburbs of Lebanon. Back to our economic news coverage. For further analysis, we're joined from Paris by the director of the World Pensions Forum and the former advisor for the World Bank, Mr. Meher Nicholas Fursley. Mr. Fursley, welcome to Q News. How might Georgieva's warning of Middle East conflict driving up the global inflation through the elevated oil prices that are forcing central banks worldwide into sharp policy rethinks amid the supply chain disruptions?
I'm delighted to join you today from Paris. To make a long story short, I think the IMF is right. Probably Georgia Kristaleva is a little too optimistic in the short, medium term. So what I'm coming at, I think the inflationary shock on the world economy, and also the shock on GDP growth, like the slowdown, the dramatic slowdown of economic growth worldwide, I think will be far, far sharper and deeper, more important than what the IMF says in the short, medium term, in the next 2-3 months, right? But I think in the long term, so let's project ourselves in 9 months or 12 months, right? If we survive all that, quote unquote, and I'm saying it half sarcastically, right? In the long term, in 9 months, in 10 months, I think the situation will not be that bad. So this is a problem we are in here. It's very bad in the short term. Why? Because let's look at the spot price, right? The spot price of the barrel of Brent oil went up 21% in the past 10 days, right? So you may say, if you're old enough, it's much less than what happened during the first Gulf War. You know, the first Gulf War was the war between Saddam Hussein and Ruhollah al-Khomeini, the Iraq-Iran war. And when it started, the price of oil skyrocketed much more. If we look farther in time, if we look at the Arab-Israeli war of 73, also the price of oil spiraled upward much, much more dramatically. So you may say by historic standards, today's rise is contained, right? You know, when you have a big war, after all, it's the third Gulf War, right? Mm-hmm. When you have a war as big as that, if the barrel of oil rises by only 19, 20%, 21% in 10 days, it's not much. Because most countries have huge reserves of oil. So I think people are focusing on the wrong thing here. The real issue is natural gas. Natural gas is the elephant in the room, and people don't speak about it enough for political reasons. Because of the, let's speak crudely and brutally, because of the imbecility, the idiocy of most European policymakers who have completely shut down Russian exports of natural gas. So they have, it's called a self-inflicted wound. They have inflicted a wound to their own economy. They have decided not to import Russian gas from Siberia, and they have decided, deliberately influenced, quote unquote, by Joe Biden, to import a lot of natural gas from Qatar and from America. And now they say, oh my God, Qatar is shutting down its natural gas production. We are going to die. So this is once again, it's a wound. It's very bad for the European economy, but it's largely a self-inflicted wound, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Well, if it is a self-inflicted wound, then how should the policymakers respond to these broader risks of Iran conflict forcing a global policy rethink, as Georgieva warned, when the Middle East disruptions are simultaneously inflating costs and straining supply chains?
Right. Well, Georgieva herself, she's Bulgarian, and so she comes from one of the only kind of pragmatic countries in Europe. So what I'm coming at is, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and to a lesser extent, Romania, whichever party is in power, they haven't completely cut down and severed economic ties with Russia, but most of the others have completely stopped importing natural gas. And the problem is psychological here, verging on psychiatric. It's a taboo. So Russia, the Russia-Ukraine war, has become a taboo, and that taboo is not grounded in reality. So it is disproportionate. So it's only proportionate if you are if you are in Lithuania, right? If you are in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Poland, maybe the Russian taboo is rooted in reality. It's, Russia is your neighbor, blah blah blah. They may invade you, blah blah blah. It's very unlikely. But if you are in Berlin or Paris or London, that taboo is mostly psychological, right? Russia is not going to invade Manchester or Bordeaux, right? So they created that monster and they inflated that monster. We're speaking about finance and economics. Today, the GDP of Russia is 15% smaller than the GDP of Italy or Spain. So clearly, it is not a threat to Britain or France or Germany, but they created that monster for political reasons. And it's difficult for them, for political, psychological reasons, to say, we were wrong. Everything we told our voters in the past 4 years was a big lie. We were wrong. We lied to you. Let's import natural gas from Siberia. If they do it, it will be great for the economy, right? But politically, the price to pay for them is too big. So it's easier to say, oh my God, there is a war in the Gulf. Oh my God, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. It's because of the Americans, the Arabs. Let's blame it on Trump. Let's blame it on Trump. It's because of Trump, because of the Arabs, because of the Iranians. It's easier for them to say that than to face reality.
Mm-hmm. Well, is there a way that the U.S. can compensate such a tough situation that European countries would be in, in order not to embarrass themselves and ask for to import natural gas from Russia, for instance? Maybe they would the U.S. would ease on the defense spending or go easy on some of the tariff threats as well?
It's very unlikely, and I'm saying it half sarcastically. So the short answer is no, of course. I think Donald Trump needs to focus on his own voters because inflation is global. And this is a paradox. Even though America has a lot of oil and natural gas, yes, now, unlike the previous Gulf wars, right? Unlike the Saddam Khomeini and Saddam Bush wars, today America has a lot of domestic production of oil and gas. But even them will suffer from the inflationary shock because pricing is global, right? So even if you have a lot of the stuff in your home backyard, the price is international. So I think Trump is going to focus on helping middle class and working class American voters, yes. So I think he's going to give them some help, some fiscal, financial help to allow that, working man in Oklahoma or Pennsylvania, when he goes to refill his minivan, not to be hurt from the war if it continues, and it will continue, but he's going to do nothing to help Europe, of course. Today, in this day and age, in the age of geoeconomics, it's every man for himself, right? It's a new age of national egoism. And if I may, people, when I say people, is Europeans, right? Europeans and Middle Easterners, and even the American left, and even part of the American right, so even part of the Republican MAGA voters who voted for Trump. They're all saying, oh, his hand was pulled by Benjamin Netanyahu. So, Netanyahu went to Washington, D.C. 16 days ago, and then 5 days later, the war started. Israel is dragging us into that war, right? And I think it's not true. It looks like that. So the optics, the visual optics are bad for Trump, but I think it's not true. I think Trump is very different from George W. Bush or Dick Cheney or Tony Blair. He's not a pro-NATO, pro-Israel policymaker. He has his own agenda, and Trump's agenda is not related to Iran's nuclear capability or Iran's capacity to produce big ballistic missiles. That is what Israel and Europe worry about. He doesn't. So the reason I think he went to war is geo-economic, geo-financial.
Yes.
I think it's about, for him, for American economic nationalists like Trump, who are in the mold of Theodore Roosevelt. There are bull moose Republicans, and that kind of animal is difficult to understand in Europe and the Middle East. But for bull moose Republicans like Trump, Iran is about rare earth minerals, natural gas, and logistics. And when I say
Yes.
logistics, I mean the new Silk Road, right? It is at the heart of the new Silk Road. It has huge untapped natural gas reserves and rare earth mineral reserves. This is the reason why he went to war.
Yes, that is very true. From Paris, that was the director of the World Pensions Forum and former advisor for the World Bank, Mr. Meher Nicholas Fursley. Mr. Fursley, thank you very much for your insights. Now, the Financial Times has reported that the group of 7 finance ministers will discuss a joint release of oil from emergency reserves coordinated by the International Energy Agency. 3 G7 countries, including the US, have so far expressed support for the idea. The Financial Times said, citing sources, and added that the ministers and the IEA Executive Director, Faith Birol, will hold a call to discuss the impact of the Iran war. Oil prices came off earlier highs on Monday, but were still up more than 15% at levels not seen since mid-2022, as some major producers cut supplies, and fears of prolonged shipping disruptions gripped the market due to the expanding US-Israeli conflict with Iran. Brent crude futures were up $15.51 or 16.7% at $108.2 a barrel, on track for the biggest ever jump in a single day, while US West Texas Intermediate crude futures were up $14.23 or 15.7% at $105.13 a barrel. We're joined from London by the international oil and energy expert, Mr. Mamdouh Salameh. Mr. Salameh, welcome to Q News. How is oil powering gains, yet tracking for a record surge amid the escalating Iran conflict? What does this mean for the global inflation outlooks?
Well, let's start by saying that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is the biggest crisis since the 2003 American invasion of Iraq, when the price then rose from $40 a barrel to around $110 a barrel and cost the global economy $6 trillion. Now, what's happening now is that 20 million barrels of oil which pass through the Strait of Hormuz and 85 tons of LNG, Qatari LNG, which also pass the Strait of Hormuz, are out of the market. There is no way of shipping them and supplying the world with it. As a result, the global, depending on how long the closure continues, if it stays for 2 months, I think the global economy will have to shed 2% of its economic growth, from 3.3 expected this year to 1.3%, maybe even lose the 1.3%, depending how long it stays. Another thing is that will force the governments, major consumers of oil, especially in Europe and the United States, to use their inventories. And this means they will be exchanging high prices for loss of energy security. And that's more damaging even than the high prices, particularly that we are in a world whose tension is escalating day after day, thanks to the United States and Israel.
Well, how high and for how long would a prolonged Iran conflict disruptions push the oil prices beyond the already high current surges?
Well, the price, as long as the Strait of Hormuz is shut, the price will continue to rise. And some of the reasons behind that is that the producers will have to cut their production. They cannot keep producing for oil which they cannot send through the Strait of Hormuz. And that creates a storage problem. The storage problem is very difficult for many countries of the Gulf region. However, depending, as I said, how long the closure remains, I think the price could easily hit $120 a barrel, if not go a bit beyond that. And that is a price the global economy cannot tolerate, because it will cause global inflation. And global inflation, once it has started, it is difficult to control. So we are in a very, very difficult situation and nowhere to go to replace the 20 million barrels which used to pass through the Strait of Hormuz.
Mr. Salame, pardon, what measures are governments going to take to limit the economic fallout from the Iran war as oil prices record new surges? Or do you think the situation is entering an area where it's beyond repair?
Well, there is always a solution. If you are referring about Egypt, which its budget depends on a price of oil of $75 for Brent crude. If that is the case, Egypt has two options. The first option is to concentrate on importing Russian crude. Given the close relations between Egypt and Russia, it will get it. And with that, it might even get a discount as China and India and Turkey are getting. That's one measure. The other measure, if the crisis stays for more than 2 months, Egypt will have no alternative but to ration the use of oil, give priorities to taxes and services, and reduce the amount made available for private use of cars. Otherwise, the deficit in the balance of trade of Egypt will mushroom, and that will be very dangerous for Egypt, particularly against a background of a reduction of the shipping through the Suez Canal.
Mr. Salame, you've mentioned that the oil-producing countries might have to cut down on production for a little bit, but it would create some sort of a storage problem. So then how will the oil industry adapt to the sustained 10% rise in prices from the Middle East conflict?
The oil industry is happy about that, as you know. They flourish when the oil price goes up, and that enables them to invest heavily on the exploration for oil and the expansion of the production capacity. The oil industry or international oil companies always make money when the price is very high. I mean, high enough that it doesn't harm the global economy. But now we are in a stage, we are heading toward a price which could harm the global economy. And furthermore, these international oil companies, particularly American and European companies, they need the reserves to replace what they produce. and they are not going to find it easily when the Suez, when the Strait of Hormuz is shut and everybody is keeping every barrel of oil out of the Strait of Hormuz. So they will be eventually in trouble. Initially they will make money, but eventually they will be in trouble. The only solution is the lifting of the or the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Unfortunately, Iran will not permit that until the aggression by the United States and Israel against it comes to a stop.
What about the International Energy Agency? How effective could a joint IEA coordinated release of oil from emergency reserves being discussed by the G7 finance ministers be limiting the inflation risks caused by the conflict-driven oil prices surges?
Yes, I answered that point in that they can release some the reserves they have, but in a time of escalating tension in the world, they will be replacing high oil prices with loss of energy security, and that's of great importance. That's why I say they might succeed a bit in keeping the wheel going, but in the end, they will be under considerable pressure and their reserves will start to decline if they are not replaced within the next 2 months by oil from the Arab Gulf.
Mr. Salame, in what ways is the Iran conflict boosting U.S. Gulf oil prices to the 2020 highs? What does this mean for the global supply dynamics as a whole?
Well, it is not Iran's exports which affect the global demand for oil or global supply. It is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. As it happens, some producers like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Iran have oil pipelines that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. But the amount combined that they can produce and send through these pipelines are limited, maybe up to 4 to 5 million barrels a day. But that leaves Iraq, which is the second biggest producer in OPEC, and leaves Kuwait as well, the fourth or fifth biggest producer, and Qatar. Don't forget that Qatar is the second biggest producer and exporter of LNG to the world. It exports every day, it exports 85 million tons of LNG annually. That's a huge amount. Before the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the price of LNG and gas was declining. Now it is shooting to the skies. And will be the biggest loser in the world? Of course, the European Union. They banned Russian gas and Russian oil, and they are depending on the United States LNG, which is sold to them 2 to 4 times the price of Russian piped gas. So the Europeans were in a real mess. Their economy was emaciating very quickly and deindustrializing, meaning that many of their major companies in Europe have been relocating, seeking cheaper energy prices.
Yes.
So, as you appreciate, Europe now will have to pay higher prices than the American LNG, and America does not have the capacity to supply all Europe's needs.
Yes, of
So
course.
they are the biggest loser.
From London, that was the international oil and energy expert, Mr. Mamdouh Salame. Mr. Salame, thank you very much, sir, for your insights. And now we move on to more economic updates with Rana Al-Assas in our newsroom. Rana.
Thank you so much, Haney. You're still watching Q News, bringing you the latest developments. Here are the top economic stories making headlines this hour. In Europe, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has revealed that Italy is considering cutting fuel excises duties using higher than expected value-added tax revenues triggered by rising pump prices. As businesses worried the conflict in the Middle East could sharply raise energy costs, she noted that the government was studying possible activation of so-called mobile excise duties, a mechanism that allows the state to use extra VAT receipts generated by higher fuel prices to reduce excise taxes on petrol and diesel. In Asia, Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi has revealed that Japan will consider steps to cushion the economic blow from rising fuel costs caused by the conflict in the Middle East, including curbing gasoline prices. She noted that the government is considering steps to avoid gasoline prices from rising to the levels intolerable for the public. Takaichi added that such measures could be funded by tapping reserves. President of South Korea Lee Jae-myung has announced that the government will cap domestic fuel prices for the first time in nearly 30 years to curb a surge triggered by the Middle East conflict and rising global crude prices. Speaking at an emergency meeting, Lee said authorities would swiftly introduce the maximum price system for petroleum products that have seen excessive increases. He added that South Korea will seek alternative energy sources beyond shipments passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Lee also said the 100 trillion won market stabilization program could be expanded if needed and urged the government and central bank to prepare further measures to address financial and currency market volatility. In the MENA region, Reuters has reported that Iraq's oil production from its main southern fields has dropped about 70% to 1.3 million barrels per day as exports through the Strait of Hormuz has been disrupted by the conflict with Iran. Output has been around 4.3 million ppd before the conflict. Exports also fell sharply to about 800 ppd on Sunday, with only 2 tankers loading due to the restricted vessel movement through the strait. Gold prices fell on Monday as a stronger US dollar weighed on the greenback price bullion, while higher energy costs fueled inflation concerns and further dimmed the prospects of near-term reductions in interest rates. Spot gold shed 1.4% to $5,097.70 per ounce after falling more than 2% earlier in the session. U.S. gold futures for April delivery lost 1% to $5,106. The dollar rose to a more than 3-month high, making bullion more expensive for holders of other currencies. Elsewhere, spot silver fell 1.3% to $84.42 per ounce after losing over 5% earlier in the session. That's all for the news, today's economic news roundup. Thank you for joining us. Stay informed, stay ahead. Don't forget to follow Q News on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at QNewsEG. Stay tuned for more on these fast-moving economic cripples. Thank you for watching.